Hey everyone, Gwen from Nile here, and today we're going to talk about adding payments, billing, and subscription to your SaaS application. This is really cool, one of my favorite topics, because there is only one thing better than building SaaS, and it is making money off the SaaS you built. So today we're going to learn how to do that. And we're going to use Nile database, and we are going to use Nile's built-in tenant table with some modifications to store the billing and subscription. By storing this information in the built-in tenants table, we are guaranteeing that the billing information for each tenant will remain private for this tenant, and you are protected from accidentally leaking or sharing payment information between tenants. So let me show you how we do it. First thing, we better create a database. So let's start with that. Okay, so you can see here our new database, and it has a tenant table. This is a built-in table with Nile meant to store all our wonderful customers. And in order to manage subscription, I'm going to add 3 columns to this table. Okay, so we created those 3 new columns. You can see that I have one for customer ID, I have one for subscription ID, and I have one for tenant tier. Tenant tier is specific for my application. It has nothing to do with Stripe. I invented my tiering. I'm going to have a free tier, and I'm also going to have one paid tier. Your application may have a different set of tiers. You can go wild. The customer ID and subscription ID are part of the integration with Stripe. So when a tenant first decides to pay you, Stripe will automatically create a customer where it may store some details about them, but it's a repeat identifier. If you ever need the payment history, the subscription history for this tenant, you will ask Stripe using this customer ID. Subscription is for a specific purchase of a subscription. So if someone buys paid subscription of your SaaS and then cancels it, you'll still have the customer ID, but you will no longer have a subscription ID, or the old subscription ID will be removed from Stripe and will become completely useless. So this is why we have both of them. Last thing we have to do here before we're completely done and off to create our product in Stripe is to grab connection detail for the database so our application can connect to it. Don't forget to keep your credentials safe. They are secret, and if anyone gets them, they will be able to access your database. Keep it secure. We have our database. Time to create a Stripe account. So we're going to register with our email. And then we need a super secure password. Okay, and now we need to check our email for verification. When you get your verification email, you'll see a link for verification. It will lead you to this screen where you need to fill in the password for your Stripe account once again. This is how they verify that the email goes to the right person. Now I'm going to skip a bunch of intermediate screens and get straight to the dashboard. So not activating anything, not giving them any extra product information, nothing of the sort. Basically close the whole thing and go straight to the developer page where I grab my API keys. Stripe has a publishable public key and a secret key. I'm going to grab them both. Once I have both keys, I'm going to go to the rest of the menu and click on Product Catalog and introduce my first test product. So I'm just going to give it my new SaaS application name. I can put a description or an image. This is all up to you. The important thing is to make sure it is a recurring payment, because we want a subscription, not a one-off like when you're purchasing a product. The amount doesn't matter. Let's make it a $10 amount SaaS. And that's it. We have our very first product. Okay, so we have our database and we have a Stripe account. Time to start running our example application. And as you may guess, first step in running an application is to clone the repository with the examples. Okay, and now that we cloned it, we are going to edit the configuration. And the way we're going to edit the configuration is by copying an example configuration file into the actual configuration file and then editing a bunch of values. Okay, so first thing to notice is that we have environment variables with the word public in them. They are public in the sense that your users, other people, can actually see them. They are exposed to the browsers. So don't put anything secret in them. The other parameters that don't have the word public in them, they are secret, and therefore you can put the database credentials and the Stripe secret key in those. Be very careful, never put anything secret where it says public. So we're going to put public information like our workspace name and the database name in those public parameters. And over here in the private parameters, we're going to put the credentials to access our database. Those are secret, so treat them as a secret. And also, of course, our Stripe secret key. Remember that Stripe has a public key and a secret key. Over here, we're putting the secret key, which is the one we're going to use today in general. Okay, and the rest of the parameters we can just ignore. Great, now that we have the parameters, we're installing dependencies. And it's time to run our application. Great, looks like it started successfully. Let's take a look in the browser. To start using our application, I'm going to sign up as a fake user with just an email and password that I'm completely making up. And now I'll create some tenant for the demonstration. And now we have multiple billing plans, and you can see that the tenant got created with a free tier paying $0 a month. This is our current plan. And I can upgrade him to a basic SaaS at $10 a month. This is the plan I recently created in Stripe. You can see that when I clicked on upgrade, it redirected me to Stripe. And now I get to fill in my credit card details. This is Stripe in test mode. So they have this secret credit card that I can use, and it will look like the payment came through successfully, but it will not going to charge anything or anyone. They also have cards for payments that fail to go through if you want to do thorough testing. So as long as the credit card number is all those 42s, you can put any values that you want as long as they are actual valid values. So the verification has to work. It cannot be a date in the past for the expiration date, for example. Okay, once I'm done with that, clicking on subscribe, and this redirects us back to my application where you can see that now I have a basic SaaS subscription at $10 a month. If we switch to the Nile console and query the tenants table, you can see that we now have all the information from Stripe, the customer ID, the subscription ID, back in our database in Nile. And we also changed the tenant tier to basic to indicate their new status. Keep in mind that the tenant table is a tenant-aware table, meaning that every row is actually located in the virtual tenant database of a different tenant, meaning that the information about the subscription and the customer and all the payment information for every customer is stored in a database that is isolated from all the other tenants and accessible only by the tenant who has access to this information, the tenant who owns it. Now, it's not tons of information, it's just a bunch of IDs. You still need access to Stripe to use them, but it's still more security than you would normally get from a database. Back in the application, let's try to downgrade our tenant. So you can see that it's downgraded. We're back on the free tier. Let's take a look at what it looks like in the database at the same time. So we're back in the database, we query the tenants table, and you can see that we no longer have a subscription number and the tenant tier is now free, but we still have a customer ID because the customer ID is still useful if you want to look up the customer in Stripe, check the payment information, show some history. Now that we've seen that this all works, let's take a look at the code behind the scenes. So we're going to start our review of the code from the tenants page. This is the page you see immediately after signing up when you create your first tenant. And it's just a form. Because we're using NextJS form actions, we have the ability for the form to call an action in the same application. It doesn't go to a completely separate backend app, so it will be easy for us to browse around here. So we can see the actions that runs when we create a tenant, and basically this is just calling the Nile SDK and saying create tenant and gives a tenant name. The tenant is created with the free tier, and remember that when we created the column, we gave it a default of free. We don't have to specify anything here, it will be a free tenant. Now, after we create a tenant, we go to the billing page. So let's take a look at the billing page. A lot of what we see here is just us drawing out the different options and the explanations and all the boxes. And a lot of the decision what to draw is based on data in the database. What is the current plan? Do we have an option to downgrade? Do we have an option to upgrade? If the current plan is free, it makes no sense to allow downgrading, for example. Now, when we click upgrade, for instance, we take another form action, which is create a checkout session. This is the action that is going to end up redirecting us to Stripe, and it has logic for getting from Stripe the URL that we will then redirect to. So it actually generates a URL in Stripe before redirecting. Let's take a look at that. So this is the create checkout session, and you can see here that we're calling Stripe and saying create a checkout session. We pass along information like what is the price, what is the quantity, billing address. Most important, we pass in two URLs. What to do after checkout, after the customer paid, in case of success and in case things did not work out. So in case of success, we wanted to call back our checkout success API. We'll see it in a second. And we need Stripe to pass in the checkout session ID so we can get information about the checkout from Stripe on that landing page, and the tenant ID, because otherwise, because the second redirect from Stripe back to us is a separate session coming from the browser from Stripe, if Stripe doesn't provide a tenant ID, we will not know who has successfully checked out. So we need Stripe to give us these two bits of information, and we are telling it, please redirect back with this information. If The checkout was not successful, customer changed their mind, bad credit card, no problem, just letting it back on the billing page where they're still in the old tier. Now let's take a look at the API page that we prepared for Stripe to lend us after a successful checkout. So first thing we do is grab the two parameters that we made sure Stripe will give us after we are back from checkout. And then we use the session ID to retrieve the checkout session from Stripe. And out of this checkout session, we grab the customer ID. Hopefully it did its job and we actually have one. Then we get connection to Nile's tenant database, meaning we're connecting to the virtual database just for this tenant. There is no way for us to accidentally update all tenants with our customer ID and subscription ID or update the wrong tenant. We're landing on exactly the tenant that Stripe told us to update. And then we do the update. So we call the tenant Nile DB with an update and we say this is the customer ID, this is the subscription ID, and the tenant here is no longer free, it is now basic. So we're basically storing references that Stripe provides us from the customer checkout session so we can later refer to them elsewhere in the code. So we're back on the billing page, and the last thing I want to show you is what happens when the customer clicks on cancel subscription. So we run the cancel subscription action, and it's much simpler than the previous flow. We don't need to redirect or anything like that. We grab the subscription ID out of Nile database where we previously stored it, and we call Stripe with cancel subscription and this subscription ID. That's it. Once Stripe confirms that this was successful, we go back to Nile and we say, please update the tenant's database. The tenant is now free because they canceled the subscription. And we also change the Stripe subscription ID to null. We're not going to need it. Subscription IDs in Stripe are no longer valid after the subscription has been canceled. We still have the customer ID that we can use in Stripe to get the history if we want to, or anything else customer did in the past. We are not going to need the subscription ID because at this point it is no longer valid in Stripe. And that's about it. I've shown you everything about managing billing and payment in Stripe with Nile. Okay, so let's sum things up. First of all, we created a database and we extended the built-in tenant table with Stripe information, customer ID and subscription ID, and also a tenant tier. Then we went to Stripe and we created a new product with a subscription at $10 a month cost. I've shown you how in your application you can create a checkout flow that redirects from your application to Stripe, allows the customer to complete the subscription, and then redirects back to your application with the necessary information so you can go and store references to the Stripe subscription and the new tier in your database in Nile. We've also shown you how to use the subscription ID in case the customer wants to cancel the subscription. There is a lot more we can do in this kind of application. We can show the customer his payment and subscription history, month by month, how many months he's been subscribed, how much he paid. We can also allow the customer to do other management activities on their customer in Stripe, like update their card or change their billing address, this kind of normal things. But you have the basics, and everything that you want to add on top will work either the same way that checkout does, where you redirect to Stripe and tell Stripe how to redirect back, or like cancel, where you make a simple API calls. These are two of basic ways that you can integrate your application with Stripe, and you've seen how Nile tenant-aware database helps you keep the information for the Stripe subscription for each tenant private to that tenant because you store it in the virtual database for every one of the tenants, and Nile provides you with the tenant isolation you need. So I hope it's been enjoyable and educational. I hope you will all run out, clone this example, and add billing to your own SaaS. I hope you will find it as straightforward as I found it. And if it works, if you have paying customers in your SaaS application, or if things don't work and you want to ask us a question and figure something out, we are available in Nile's Discord. Please join us and tell us about your successes or about your questions. Looking forward to seeing you there.